Hi everyone, welcome to this sort of supplementary video to my most recent video on Yotsuba and how it teaches you Japanese as supplementary reading material. In that video I went over how Yotsuba is almost entirely by accident, I'm sure, this perfect sort of encapsulation of a first manga for someone to read when they're trying to learn Japanese. So if you haven't seen that video, please watch it because I'm going to be referring to a lot of things that I talked about in there. The main reason I want to make this video is that there were so many different points that I wanted to include in the video that I felt either were going to just break up the flow of it because it was too much of a tangent, or there were things that I wanted to sort of clarify, because the thing about language acquisition and linguistics as a field in general is that there is so many conflicting ideas because it's constantly evolving as we discover how people learn languages, this, that, and the other. And even linguists themselves don't agree a lot of the time on like the different methods and hypotheses of how people learn, so there's just so many facets to cover. I don't think I've made a video that has had as many explainer texts with little asterisks trying to clarify a point that I had made than that Yotsuba video, because there's just so much to cover. So I'm just going to address some of those points now. The first thing I want to discuss is something that's really minor and inconsequential, but it bugs me to no end. And I even included a little asterisk text in the video itself, but I just wanted to clarify it here. That being that for the first few chapters, Yotsuba's dialogue does actually contain a fair amount of basic kanji. I was actually kind of shocked by this when I was rereading the first few chapters to like cut apart the manga pages for the edit, because I feel like that the formatting of Yotsuba's dialogue is such a core part of the experience, whether you're a native or non-native speaker. It's not all the time, and considering Yotsuba's dialogue is so basic, it tends to just be some of the most common words in Japanese, like kyo, hito, shiru, ie. So it doesn't really break the immersion that much. That being said, there is a little bit of a dissonance there for me, not just because I think, again, that's such a core part of the character and the formatting, but because a quirk of kanji in Japanese is that kanji that are some of the most common kanji aren't necessarily the most simple kanji. Again, going back to ie, which is a word that she would most definitely know, and she could possibly know this kanji, but look at that fucking thing. Jesus Christ. By the time of the second volume, all of Yotsuba's dialogue is completely kanji-free. So this just feels like one of those things that Azuma probably figured out as he went along. Later chapters in the manga even build entire gags around the fact that Yotsuba can't read basic kanji. These sort of weird quirks are present in pretty much any growing series, you know, it's just the nature of storytelling and figuring out what you actually want to do with it. And the font and typesetting is basically the same, so it's not that much of a big deal, but considering how much of it was a core crux of my argument in the original video, I felt it needed addressing. One of the core arguments in my video was the use of the terms motherese and parentese to describe the dialogue of older characters talking to Yotsuba. I did put up a little brief slide explaining that it was more complicated than that, so I want to go into exactly how complicated it is here. Though motherese was the pervasive term in literature several decades ago, and it is still in use now, many modern linguists and child development professionals dislike it because it is too gendered. However, as is the case with these kind of things, a simple and universal alternative hasn't been reached or decided. Though the term parentese is offered by many linguistics, others still avoid it because this is a sort of general universal register that any adult speaks to children in regardless of parentage or not. On top of that might be the idea that, well, not all children are raised by their birth parents, and so a whole slew of alternative terms have been offered up, ranging from the relatively accessible, like caretaker speech or caregiver register, to the very obtuse, like infant-directed speech, child-directed language, and so on. The latter grouping seems to be preferred by child development professionals, but as you can see, it's a complicated bag of descriptivism, politics, and morals, as most things to do with language are. When I had originally researched and wrote the video, the term motherese was what was used in most of my research, so that's what I used. It was only until I was doing supplementary research during editing that I discovered this calamity of naming. Personally, I agree that motherese is too gendered, and I think that parentese offers a nice compromise without being too clinical like child-directed speech. So I went back and ADR'd or re-edited a few lines there to include that. That being said, I also wanted to acknowledge and preserve the usage of that term in the context of the original research I did, especially when I was directly quoting something. Also because the recording of this video ballooned out in the amount of reshoots and different setups and everything that I did that I want to cut my tongue out and live in penance for the rest of my life for the sins I have committed against God. I've done it once. I'll do it again. One more thing I want to bring up in relation to parentese is two adjacent terms, pet talk and foreigner talk. Pet talk isn't that interesting. It's basically the same as baby talk, and it's just all the bullshit that you say to their pets. It is interesting because it does seem that pets respond better in the same way babies do to pet talk because the sounds are brighter, more comforting. But for the purposes of this video on language learning, it's not important. But foreigner talk is something else entirely, having different levels of severity. Unlike with parentese, in foreigner talk, grammar is very often broken, especially depending on the other speaker's proficiency. And even with very advanced speakers of the language, natives will tend to slip back, even subconsciously, into a much simpler tone. Though the native speaker might have the best intentions when they do this, they're simply trying to make sure that the communication flows well, it can feel demeaning and patronizing. I know from my time as an English teacher that it was very easy to sort of slip into this teacher voice, which sounds very similar to baby talk and Motherese, which when you are talking to adults can feel patronizing. So I tried my best to avoid it, and in particular I tried my best to avoid breaking grammar. Foreigner talk can also exacerbate the phenomenon that people tend to judge, even subconsciously, how intelligent someone is based on how well they can speak. Think of it like this. If you start talking to a non-native speaker in a register that is very similar to baby talk, you might start subconsciously assuming that they have the mentality of a baby as well. Anyway, there's a whole can of worms I probably shouldn't really bring up right now. You might be like, why the fuck is he talking about all this? But the reason I do is that you could make the argument that this is another part of the Yotsuba experience. It's a little bit of a stretch, and I might go in a weird direction, but just bear with me here. It said that Koiwai adopted Yotsuba while he was overseas visiting another country when she was still just a baby. Though the details of her situation before she was adopted is never really made clear, the fact that a Japanese man was able to adopt her, move her back to Japan without any red tape is indicative of it not being particularly great. Though it is unlikely that Yotsuba would have had any exposure to Japanese before she was adopted, in reality that really shouldn't impair her language learning ability at all. Studies show that young children are language absorbing machines and can output incredibly complex sentences really rapidly as soon as the ball gets rolling when they start actually speaking. At the age Yotsuba was adopted, any child can learn any language as long as they are given sufficient exposure to it. There are even cases of feral children, or children considered feral due to abandonment or neglect, that were later able to acquire full linguistic capability later in life. One such example is the child codenamed Isabella, who was found at 7 years old in a dark room with no one else but her deaf-mute mother and no linguistic capability whatsoever. After she was found, she was put into the care of skilled medical professionals and socially integrated into the children's ward. In a short period of time, she rapidly gained a vocabulary of about 2,000 words, and within a few years, had full linguistic speech output. There does seem to be an age limit. There is the case of the child codenamed Genie, who had a tumultuous living situation after she was found at 13 and never quite fully gained linguistic capabilities. But all the research does seem to point to young children being hardwired to learn language. Anyway, that was a bit of a weird tangent. I know you probably didn't expect me to start talking about fucking feral children when I started going on this video. But my point is that at no point in the manga is Yotsuba's Japanese linguistic skills called into question. But several characters do frequently point out when meeting her for the first time that she looks foreign. And a core part of the series is how inquisitive and unfamiliar she is with normal, everyday Japanese life in a way that a normal Japanese child wouldn't. And this could just be the nature of the character, of course, but you could interpret this as just another layer to the patience that characters show when explaining these things to her. Though logically, this could be chalked up to just her living in the countryside before moving to the city, it could easily be read as other characters looking at her appearance and assuming that she's foreign, and thus she struggles with the language itself. And her simplified conversations with these characters are not just in parentese, but in foreigner talk as well. Again, I'm not saying that this was Azuma's intention when designing the character or when making her foreign. I don't think any of this was Azuma's intention. I think he was designing a series made for Japanese readers. Though there is a quiet melancholy to Yotsuba's backstory, I highly doubt that Azuma intended for something quite as dark as the issues facing foreign-born Japanese in modern Japan or fucking feral children. Again, I'm not saying Yotsuba's a fucking feral child. At my level of Japanese, I can't discern if there are any subtle nuances that paint her grammar as particularly broken compared to a Japanese child, or if there is any sort of gaijin-poi nature about it. As far as I know, despite being foreign-born, she talks and acts as Japanese as anybody. But I do think it's interesting to note the possibility of reading it in such a way, and how if you do read it in that way, it just adds another little facet to that connection with Yotsuba. Language learning is as much about learning the culture of the country that a language comes from, and since the manga is about learning about Japanese daily life, then, well, all these little quirks or happy accidents that just go into making a package that is like lightning in a bottle for learning Japanese. The next thing I want to do is to compare Yotsuba to Azuma's previous work, Azumanga Daioh, as in regards to language learning material. Both of them share a lot of similarities, being from the same author, having very similar art styles, comedic beats, and just overall atmosphere. But due to their differing settings and key demographics, I think they can't be considered the same in regards to language learning material. As I said in the main video, any native Japanese material at all can be useful for language learning if it interests you and you approach it in the right way. And this still very much applies to Azumanga Daioh, although not this one because this one is the English version, I don't have the Japanese version. Depending on your Japanese level and your preferred learning style, Azumanga Daioh could be better, but also could be worse, depending on the person. For me, I think Yotsuba is better suited for someone who is trying to read raw manga for the very first time, and Azumanga Daioh suits someone who is more at this sort of higher intermediate level. The key difference comes down to two things: furigana and overall settings. Unlike Yotsuba, Azumanga Daioh has little to no furigana. Despite being published in the same manga, we can see how their demographics differed, with Yotsuba going for a much more broader, family-friendly demographic, and Azumanga targeting teenagers and young adults. Though by no means filthy or heavy, Azumanga Daioh does have some jokes that a child is likely not to get. And due to the fact that high schoolers have gone through all the Joyo kanji in their mandatory education at this point, the inclusion of furigana is deemed unnecessary. This is true even of Chiyo-chan, who is kind of the closest thing to a pod character we have in the manga, who, despite having a lot of parallels to Yotsuba, in many ways is completely different. Other than the age difference and therefore the difference in linguistic ability, Chiyo-chan is a child prodigy, having advanced all the way up to high school early. Her intelligence and her use of keigo in particular means that some of her dialogue can be more complicated than some of the older girls. All of this means that Azumanga is a harder read than Yotsuba, not significantly, not to someone who, has done N1 and knows 50 billion kanji because they read fucking Nekopara or some shit like that, but comparatively it's a harder read, in a way that I don't think that a beginner should tackle it as their first manga. That being said, there are some ways that I think Azumanga is better from a certain point of view for a more proficient Japanese student. While furigana is a great tool for children and beginners of the language, after you reach a certain level of proficiency in reading kanji, they can even become a hindrance. They naturally draw your eye, even if you know how to already read that kanji or that compound word. And considering their smaller font size, it can considerably slow down your reading if there's a lot of them. For me, the biggest upside to kanji in the Japanese writing system is that once you know a kanji, once you know how to read a kanji, it makes reading faster. Computer turned off. Take watashi, for example. It's one of the first kanji that people learn because it's omnipresent in daily life. Rather than having to read 3 separate kana, you just have the one kanji character, thus registering in your brain much faster. Natives don't read a word 1 character at a time. It's a very, very complex situation where your brain goes through its mental catalog of shapes depending on the shape of the word and the shape around it, and kind of goes through process of elimination in order to find the right word. It does this in like a billionth of a second. There's a very great and interesting video about it that I will link to here. And that's not to say it doesn't happen with hiragana, it definitely does, but it tends to be the words that are commonly written in hiragana, like the grammatical parts of speech, like dewanai, for example. Watashi is more commonly written in its kanji form, meaning you're much less likely to be exposed to the hiragana form of the word, meaning it's much less likely to register in that sort of mental dictionary in your brain. The same phenomenon probably happens all the time in your native language, where you're reading something and you come across a word you've never seen before, you pause a little bit to read it out, and maybe it's a word you have heard and never read, or something like that, but it tends to slow down just that fraction of a second. Individually, it's not a problem, but if every single word has furigana attached to it, this can all add up, and the clutter can make reading a frustrating experience. Especially if they're words you see every day multiple times, like hito, jikan, kyo, ie, kinkyū jitai sengen. I lived in Japan during 2020. I saw this word every day. Furigana can also be a bit of a crutch, and I know there are more than a few words where I have definitely seen the kanji enough to be exposed to it and remember it, but I don't because I just rely on reading the furigana. I don't want to make it out to be a massive issue or anything like that, it's not. And I don't want to make it seem that Yotsuba is an annoying read to an advanced learner, because it's definitely not. It's great, please read it, it's lovely. But to an intermediate learner with a decent amount of kanji under their belt, Azumanga Daioh might be the smoother, more challenging, and thus more rewarding experience. And I got something for the story perspective too, like I did with Yotsuba and all the parentese and the foreigner talk and everything. Like, from a story perspective, Chiyo-chan still has that fish out of water element that Yotsuba does. She's book smart, but she doesn't have any experience. She's naive and she doesn't quite understand grown-up social situations. In this way, it can mimic the experience of someone studying abroad. They have the knowledge of the textbook, the guidebook, and the internet, but those things don't always hold a candle to experiencing the true thing. As I keep repeating, any native material with the right language tools can be useful for language learning. And again, in the grand scheme of things, Azumanga Daioh is not that difficult. So it's all about considering your needs, your level, and what exactly you want in a reading experience. The final thing I want to bring up is in regards to Yotsuba's origins. You may know that while Azumanga was Azuma's first real big break, the premise of Yotsuba actually predates it in two separate properties called Try Try Try. The first is a webcomic made in 1998, and the second is a one-shot manga included in the second anthology of Azuma's rare works released in 2001. There isn't that much to say on them, as the characters are pretty fleshed out and as they are in the final product, the key difference being that Fuka is blatantly hot for Yotsuba's dad.
Nice.
There are also some art style differences, like Fuka has a ponytail and lacks the brows, and Yotsuba's pigtails are drawn in a much more realistic manner, similar to what happened with Chiyo's pigtails in Azumanga, where they started out looking kind of normal and then ended up becoming whatever the fuck they are. But it's interesting how it would have differed as a language learning resource compared to the final Yotsuba product. Like in Azumanga, there's no furigana. Secondly, there's more of a surreal tone to it, especially in the webcomic. One of them involves Fuka buying a pet alligator and Enna not realizing it's right there in the living room. It's a little strange. The focus also wasn't solely on Yotsuba, it was more spread out among the characters. These sorts of pilot chapters or pilot episodes are always really fascinating to me, to see what was there from the get-go, what was decided later on, what was changed, and ultimately what could have been. So, the final words that I want to leave you on today are... the final words I want to leave you on are that, yeah, pick up Yotsuba if you want to. It's very, very interesting as a Japanese resource learning. I haven't written anything for the conclusion, I'm just going to ramble. I might even put up my Patreon stuff here now, just get it out of the way. I'm not done, I might say something interesting, in these next couple seconds. Surely it'll come to my brain. そうかな。何も出てこない。Alright, see you cunts.